So, hi, I'm Molly with Hands on Knitting Center, and we are getting ready to participate in the Marie Greene 4-day knit along. This year, the pattern is Fireworks, and it looks super, super fun. But as a shop in a super warm place where we spend a great deal of the year in excess of 90 degrees, we tend to take this pattern and take the opportunity to look at how to change a pattern that's written as sort of a wintry pattern made out of wool, sort of higher neck, long sleeve, the whole bit, and change it into a summery sort of pattern by changing the yarn to a plant-based fiber. Still the same weight, so not a massive change of gauge or anything, so still the same weight, but changing from wool to plant-based. And then changing the neckline a bit so it's a little bit lower, making it short sleeved or shorter sleeved, and little changes like that. So we do a free knit along that goes along with her knit along. If you're unfamiliar with it, I've linked down to Marie Greene's page in Ravelry. She's also doing a really super fun Facebook group, and she does this every year. So if you're seeing this not 2021, you're going to find that she'll do something else. And we just adore her. She's a beautiful designer. This is always super fun to be able to do a pattern, knit a sweater, I should say, in as little as 4 days. But don't judge yourself. If it takes you longer, it's okay. And I think we actually give ourselves like 5 days to do it. And then our final reveal is on the 6th day. So anyway, what I'm going to talk about today is sort of that change in moving from a wool to a plant-based fiber. So number one, wool is a very elastic fiber. It has a good memory. So you could stretch it and it bounces back, stretch it and it bounces back. And this sort of keeps your stitches looking lovely. The sweater keeps its shape really nicely. The yarn that she recommended as a DK weight, wool, superwash wool and nylon blend. So superwash means they have most likely done two things, and that is strip the yarn of the fiber of its scales. So it's very much like human hair, right? Where there are little scales on it. So you strip those off, and then oftentimes a coating goes on top of it as well. So what that does to wool is it takes wool from being sort of a sticky fiber that holds its shape really, really well to allowing to grow a little bit more, which is a little closer to a plant-based fiber. Nylon adds a lot of strength to the yarn, but it's also kind of a slippery fiber, a very smooth fiber. So it doesn't necessarily add an elastic, but it doesn't necessarily like help it keep shape any better. So bottom line, moving from a superwash wool to a plant-based, we know that we're going to get in both of them some growth in the length of the sweater. But if your plant-based fiber has a bit of cotton or quite a bit of cotton, remember that you're also going to get your growth width-wise. And so you want to take that into consideration when you do your gauge. Also, plant-based fibers are much happier on a firmer gauge. So this is a DK weight with a gauge of 5 stitches to the inch, and I believe 7 rows to the inch.
Okay, so the yarn that we're going to use for the Fireworks sweater is Remix Light. So this is a really cool yarn that is recycled fibers, really lovely, but this like crazy mixture of man-made cotton, silk, and linen. And you're about 50-50 man-made versus plant-based. I realize that silk is protein, but it acts like plant-based. So you actually have some stickiness and stability to this yarn that you don't have with all plant-based yarns. So we don't have to make quite as many concessions, but we still want to think about what the gauge is going to look like before and after washing. So what I did is I have two different gauges, gauge swatches right here. This is on a size 6 needle. This is on a size 7 needle. I use a little pearl bumps so that after I wash it and I'm all done, I know which one is the 7, which one is the 6, and a little divider in between so I can find a really clean space for a counting gauge. So when I said that plant-based fiber is like a firmer gauge, this is why. So if I hold this up, see how this like sort of expands out, and I'm not pulling very hard. I'm just like putting just a little bit of pressure on it and see how it sort of stays expanded. If I do that same amount of pressure on the more dense gauge and put it back down, it doesn't stay as stretched out. And this is where you're going to find that this firmer gauge will wear much better, and this one is the one that's going to sort of expand out and grow down and not be as stable. So the other thing to keep in mind is this is a pre-washing gauge, and once again, I can't stress this enough. Plant-based fibers love to be washed and dried. This yarn, washing on cool, drawing on tumble dry, gives you the most amazing fiber ever. Any inconsistency in your gauge literally goes out in the wash, and it sort of blooms. So I did the two different gauge swatches because I wanted to make sure I have two shots at getting this gauge right. I almost started with a size 5, right? Usually I do one smaller, the size of the needle that the pattern wants, and then one larger. But I'm pretty sure I'm going to want one of these two sizes. If I guessed wrong, then I will come back to the drawing board and I will do another gauge swatch and wash it and do all this work over again. And that may sound like a ton of work to you, but I want you to keep in mind that all of that extra work that you put into your sweater now, into these swatches, is going to give you a sweater that's really going to wear well. Okay. The other thing that we're going to do is sort of use a little planning sheet for the whole thing. And there will be a link down below to a Google Drive to be able to grab this. So if you don't have access to Google Drive, you can email me and I can send you a copy. But bottom line, we're going to sort of talk about what the pattern is, what's the yarn suggested, what we're using, the impact of that, which is what we've just talked about. And then the gauges. So you have your pattern gauge, you have your pre-wash gauge, and I went ahead and included both of the needle sizes that I'm using. And then we're going to do our wash gauge. So that's the very next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and take this out, wash it, see what impact the gauge has. And then we're going to come back and do a little bit more talking. Okay, so I have washed my sample and I'm super happy, although it probably needs a little steam, super happy with how it's looking. And so you can sort of tell that it's filled in, right? And it shrunk about half a stitch per inch. So that takes my size 6 needle, which was 5.5 stitches per inch, down to the 5. So I'm exactly right on track for this pattern, which makes me really happy. Now, if I decided, and I want it to be pretty loose because again, it's a summer weight top, but if I wanted it to be a little bit firmer than that, I could absolutely still go down a needle size. So I am going to go ahead and hang this right with a little bit of weight underneath it and just make sure that it's not going to grow too much any which way. But again, because I know this yarn fairly well, I know there's not a ton of growth in this as to compared to a lot of other plant-based fibers. So I'm pretty good with where I am. And let me just check our 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yep, and we're right. We have 1 row more per inch than the pattern. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yeah, 1 row. So with 1 stitch more per row, I'm going to have to check as I'm sort of going through and make sure that I'm okay in the length. So where that's really going to matter is anytime that you are knitting to rows rather than knitting to inches. So especially armhole depth. So I'm just going to keep in mind that I may need to add a little row here and there to the pattern. So that's it. So then my size to fit and size to follow will be exactly the same. If you needed to be able to make a change in this because your gauge were quite different, we've created a handy little gauge change calculator for you. And there should be a link down in the information below to find this. So the pattern gauge in this particular pattern is 5 stitches to the inch. And let's just say that you ended up with that 5.5. And you are trying to make a 40-inch top. This would tell you that in order for you to get a top to fit like a 40-inch, you would want to follow the 44 because you have more stitches creating an inch than the pattern would have you have. So this is just really like a very simple, fairly brute tool to help you. And honestly, you're going to find that most helpful when you don't have a huge change in the gauge, and you are fairly and you're kind of in the medium range. So when we can't do that and can't just follow a different size, then we do a whole lot more math, which we're not going to cover in this particular video. All right, so the next thing you would do is you would sort of think about what kind of changes you want to make, and write down the impact of those changes. And that is going to be our next video, as we really talk about thinking about the neckline and how to get started. So hopefully this gives you enough to get your gauge done and get ready for our cast on. Thanks, everybody.